right, so we've been talking about discipline. We talked last week or 2 weeks ago about biblical methodology, laying the foundation with biblical methodology, laying the foundation with spanking, and how in our world today that is a very controversial topic. There are a lot of different voices out there telling you that this is the right method or that is the right method, or if you do this, it's going to do psychological harm, or if you don't do this, then your child is going to be impacted by that forever. And what we can hope in and trust in is that the Word of God is actually sufficient. It is timeless. It has given us the answers to these things. So a biblical methodology for laying a foundation of correction in our children's life, it is spanking. And not child abuse, not something that is violent or hateful, but rather spanking our children in love, disciplining them just as the Lord disciplines us, those that He loves, so that they understand that there is a consequence for wrong actions. There are consequences for wrong actions. Now, as we embrace biblical methodology, what we also want to understand and embrace is consistency. Consistency with biblical methodology. So, if you look at your notes there, we've got Colossians 3:20 at the top of the page. Colossians 3:20. We've already looked at this whole passage in light of biblical parenting, husbands and wives, understanding their roles, being faithful to the Lord in that. Now, children, what does God expect of children? He says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord. That is an imperative given to children, a command issued by God to children. Now, when God issues commands to people, we understand His inerrant word, His sufficient word, His authoritative word, given as a command, this makes it a moral requirement. This is what God expects of children living under the household of parents, that they are to obey them. What are they to obey them in? Only in some things, only when they feel like it, only when it makes sense to them? No. It says, children, obey your parents in all things. In all things. There is an authority. The Lord has designed the family in a specific way. There is an authority structure in the family. Parents, husband and wife, together, one flesh union, are an authority over the children in their household. This is a stewardship given to parents, but there is also a biblical expectation placed upon children. Children in the household are required by God morally to obey their parents. And so, this is an absolute truth statement. It's an absolute truth statement. Now, being that this is a moral command placed upon children, and it's the responsibility of parents to steward their households in such a way that the people in their household honor God, respect God, understand His word, and are committed to the moral requirements that God places on the household, that means that parents have to hold their children to this, right? If God commands children to obey their parents in all things, who is it that is responsible for holding children to that? The authorities, right? Mom and dad. It's our responsibility to hold our children to what God commands of them. And so because this is a moral requirement for our children, it also is a moral requirement for us as parents to steward them to understand this. We have to teach them to understand this. And that's why I can't stress how vital consistency is enough. We have to understand how vital consistency is. You see, if this is a moral requirement for our children, and we're to steward our households to honor and respect God, then we have to consistently apply consequences when our children disobey God. When they disobey God. when they disobey the righteous judge, the perfect judge, the one who sets the absolute truth standard, the one who has placed moral requirements on them, when they disobey him and reject him, we have to communicate to them the seriousness of that. We have to teach them, look, this is a sin issue in your life. It is a sin issue in your life, in the life of the child, when that child disobeys their parents. Now, how do you teach a 1.5-year-old, a 2-year-old, that it is a sin issue when you rebel against mommy and daddy? How do you teach them that? That's why spanking is the foundation of biblical methodology. Because we're not at a place where we can communicate all the deep theological truths of who God is and how he is a righteous judge and how there is a perfect standard. And so we begin teaching them these things through the biblical foundation of spanking. We begin teaching them these things with little communications of truth. No, don't do that. You cannot do that. Don't touch. And we start connecting that counsel, very small tidbits of counsel, we start connecting that with discipline. And yet we do that consistently because acts of disobedience are sin against God, and we want to begin laying that foundation before they even comprehend that. And so we do this by consistency. If we lack consistency, we are failing to communicate to them the righteous requirements of God. When law breaking happens and we don't bring consequence for it, we're communicating something to our children. We're teaching something to our children about worldview and about who God is. And so when we are consistent, we're also communicating to our children something about worldview and about who God is. Before they're even able to begin comprehending all the deep things of theology, we are already teaching them there is an absolute truth standard. There are consequences for every act of sin. There is a God who holds us accountable to all of these things. We have to understand that. And you may say, well, where does grace come into play? Because God is a gracious God, and we can't follow his absolute truth standard perfectly. We need grace. We need salvation. But because we all miss the mark, right? Well, we have to understand first that there is a mark, and we have to understand that we are held accountable to that mark with perfect precision. We are all held accountable to that. God does not overlook sin. He has never overlooked sin, and he never will overlook sin. Grace does not mean that he simply forgets about sin. You see, the sin that we commit, it's either punished in us or it's punished in Christ. But God is a perfect judge. He's a perfect judge. So through consistency, when our children sin, we are already teaching them the perfect righteousness of God. It's a theological concept, but it also is very practical. So not only is consistency something that we are using to communicate the perfect righteousness of God, it also is a very practical thing. A consistent consequence for every act of sin, every act of rebellion. It teaches children very clearly where boundaries are. And knowing boundaries is key to their well-being. You see, as parents, we're commanded not to exasperate our children. One of the key ways that we exasperate children is by not communicating clearly. When they don't understand where boundaries are, when the boundaries are constantly shifting and constantly changing, when sometimes I get away with this and sometimes I don't. That's poor communication. So if we're going to communicate clearly to them where boundaries are, if they're going to understand where they can function and where they can operate, consistency is clear. Consistency and discipline is in and of itself a form of communication. It is a form of communication. And children are very smart. Young children, very young children. They're very smart. They learn very quickly, especially when you're consistent. If you're not consistent, it's hard. It's difficult for them. But when you bring consistency, they learn very quickly. So, I'm gonna use the marker board, and we're gonna start to get pretty practical here. So there's the theological side to consistency. We want to communicate the perfect righteousness of God. We want to communicate that for every act of sin, there is a consequence. We're establishing those foundations from the very beginning. But it's not just that we're communicating theological concepts. This is very practical, and folks, it works. Why does it work? Well, because it's God's methodology, right? That's why it works. You've heard me say it before, the most pragmatic thing that you can do is to obey God. The most pragmatic thing that you can do is be faithful to Him. Now, it may not produce the results that I want in the moment, but ultimately it produces the results that glorify and honor God. And so this works. When we follow God's method and when we follow it consistently, it communicates clearly to our children. They comprehend it and they know where they can operate. So I'm going to move this out just a bit. Hopefully you can still hear me. We're going to talk about something, and some of you who have had some conversations with me before, you may remember the boundary box. I've talked about the boundary box with some of y'all before, and this is an illustration, okay? And all illustrations break down at some point. All right, so don't take this as though this is God's inerrant word or anything like that. There's some concepts here that we're bringing to it from the Word, but the boundary box is the place where we want our children to operate, okay, within that. So what do I mean by that? So, here's our box. What is this box? This box, can y'all still hear me all right? This box is your expectations as a parent. This is something that you establish for your children. You establish this by setting rules in your household. You establish this by communicating that they're not to be disobedient to you at any time when you give them a very clear instruction to do something. You communicate this as the place where they can operate freely. So here's your child, and that's where they are operating. They're operating within the expectations of mom and dad. They're operating according to the authority of mom and dad. They're operating inside of the box. This is a good place. This is a good place for them to be. This is a healthy place. The world tends to think of things that are constraining as bad, right? It's bad. Don't restrain them. Let them be free. Now, we're going to let them be free, but only within the box, okay? That's where they're going to operate. Now, this is not a literal box. We don't put our children in boxes. I just have to make that disclaimer, because somebody inevitably out there in the world is going to watch this video and start and build a box and actually put their child in it. No, we don't put our children in literal boxes. We're biblical methodology, right? Communication, correction, discipline. That's what we're doing. We don't put our children in boxes. This is a metaphorical box. Okay, it's just representative of your expectations for your child. So your child can operate freely within here. This is where they can express themselves. They can explore the gifts that God has given them. They can have fun. They can practice liberty, freedom. They can have freedom in here. This is where they operate healthily. Now, how do we establish this box? Well, from a very young age, you can begin establishing this. How? By spanking, right? We spank consistently to communicate that you can't operate there. Okay, so if you have a rule, don't pull the lamp off the table. Okay, no, don't touch. When they go to pull the breakable thing off the table, no, don't touch. They might not even know what no means yet, but they're going to start to put two and two together, and then they're going to start to rebel against it. Why? Because theologically, what do we understand about the hearts of our children? They have sin in their heart. Right? They have sin in their heart. They are depraved. They don't need to be taught to sin. They will sin. And so they're going to start to rebel. When you start to see that rebellion, what do? So they're going to cross the boundary. The boundary is don't touch the breakable lamp. Don't pull it off the table. So when they cross that boundary, we connect no to a consequence, a slight, painful consequence, right? And then they comprehend something. Oh, No means something I don't like is going to happen if I do it. Something I don't like is going to happen here. There's going to be a consequence for my action. So when they cross that line right there, that's where we bring the consequence. Now, what happens when they cross the line again? Do we forget? Just say, oh, well, it's all over. It doesn't work. This doesn't work. No, we just faithfully do it. Again, consistency, right? Consistency. Now, what are we doing? Here, think about it this way. They don't yet know where that line is. So they're crossing over it. We understand they're crossing over it. They don't. So what is that consequence doing for them? It is establishing for them a boundary. That's what it's doing. Now, what happens when we don't follow through? Maybe the third time we don't follow through. What have they done? They just got away with it, right? Now they're out here. They're in rebellion land. That's where they're operating now. They're operating in rebellion land. They got through the box. Now, what about these other times? Well, you know what they're thinking? Sometimes I get away with it, sometimes I don't. Maybe I'll get away with it this time, so I'm going to try it again. The line is not established for them if we're not consistent. We have to be consistent. If we're consistent, they understand, they're smart, right? Even at a very young age, if we're consistent, they understand every time I cross the line, there's a consequence that I don't like. So my sinful heart is telling me, once they get to that point of rebellion, once they get to that place where they're actually being rebellious, the sinful heart is telling them to do the thing that mom and dad don't want them to do. There's a promise there. Ooh, this looks enticing, right? There's a promise there, but the promise doesn't fulfill. The promise actually is a lie that leads to a consequence. You see how we're teaching them that? If that consequence is consistent, we establish very clearly for them where the boundary is. And so what do they do now? If you know your children well, you know exactly what they're going to do. They're going to go right up to the line and they're going to operate here. But they understand that there's a line there. There's a line that I don't want to cross because it's not going to give me what I want. It's going to give me something I don't want. I'm not going to cross that line because what's going to result every single time that I'm disobedient is that my parents are going to bring that consequence, that same consequence that I don't like. They're going to bring that to me. So I'm not going to do that anymore. Now, when people talk about that particular biblical method of discipline doesn't work for my children, an overwhelming majority of the time when you actually sit down and start talking to them about how they're implementing it, when they're implementing it, what you find out is there's not consistency. There's a lack of consistency. And folks, let me tell you this. Because children are very smart, even from a very young age, if they know that you're not consistent, they're going to keep trying it out. You haven't established for them the boundary yet. You've got to establish the boundary. Now, you may have older children that never have had a clear boundary established. What about when mom and dad discipline according to their emotions rather than consistent and clear communicated boundaries? What about that? Well, now you've got a moving boundary, right? It's a moving boundary. So sometimes I make it all the way out here before I get a consequence. Sometimes it's back here. Sometimes it's like right here. And it's always moving. Now, that's exasperating to children as well. When parents discipline out of emotion, when their severity and the time that they discipline is based on how they feel, that's extremely exasperating to a child because where can I operate? I don't know where I can operate. I don't even understand. And so what do they start to do? They start to pick up on the emotional cues of mom and dad. rather than the clear communication of where the boundary is, they know how far they can push mom and dad before the discipline is going to happen. So what do? They push you right up to that point, and they've learned, I can manipulate the emotional responses of mom and dad. I'm going to keep doing the thing right up to the point that I see your face starting to get red, and then run off. Okay, we better get out of here. Let's go. Mom's getting mad. Dad's getting mad. So we don't discipline by emotion, right? We've already talked about that. We don't discipline by a changing standard. We discipline with consistency. Now, if you think about it, if you're inconsistent and you've got holes in your box, how is this going to affect how your children operate? If they're operating inside of here, and then they see that there's a moment where they can get out, and then they operate out here in rebellion land, that's not good for them either. Because eventually you're probably going to bring some sort of consequence, but tomorrow they're going to try for the hole again, and the next day, and the next day. And maybe sometimes they get out, maybe sometimes they don't. But when you lack consistency, you see it very clearly displayed in the behavior of the child. Very clearly displayed. This is very practical stuff. So, when do we start implementing discipline? When do we start implementing it with consistency? As early as you can. As early as you can. As early as you see that rebellion. As early as you see actions that need consequence. Can I get a paper towel or something? I've drawn all over my board and I don't have anything to erase it. Thanks, Christine. So, where do we want our children to operate? We want them to operate in the boundary box. Now, what makes up these expectations? Sin. That's a primary thing that should make up the expectations that we have for our children. As Christian parents, we talked about this with God's expectation to obey the parents, but we're communicating to them God's righteous standards. So first and foremost, what should our rules, standards, expectations be for our children and our household? Well, it's that they not sin against a holy and righteous God, right? So our expectations must be in line with God's expectations. God's morality, God's moral standards. We're going to establish boundaries for them that clearly communicate God's moral standards. That means every time our children sin, we as parents need to be communicating to them there is a consequence for sin. You can't allow sin to go unchecked in your household. So your rules, first and foremost, need to be based on a foundation of biblical righteousness and biblical morality. You're not going to sin when you're in my house. You're not going to do things that are sinful against God. You're not going to have sinful ideas and sinful attitudes. You're not going to speak sinfully when they lie and deceive, when they say things that are disrespectful, when they say things that are communicating a wicked heart. We want to bring correction. When they steal, take a block from their brother or sister. When they do things that are violent against one of their siblings. When they do things that are violent against mom or dad. The world will tell you, well, because you spank your children, all they learn is violence and they're going to hit you back. No, that's not how it works. When you spank your children in love, and you do it according to biblical methodology, and then if they turn around and try to hit you back, you do it again. They understand, oh, you're the authority, I'm not. You're the authority, I'm not. And we're teaching them that that's not appropriate. Now, as they get older, we're explaining all this to them, right? We're going to talk about that in the coming weeks. We're going to talk about the counsel that must come along with correction. But we're going to start setting boundaries for our children with God's moral standard. So we're not going to allow our children to sin in our household. Whether it be how they treat us, whether it be how they treat their siblings, whether it be the actions that they're committing in our household, we're not going to allow them to sin in our household. We're going to bring a consistent consequence for sin. Okay? We are disciplining sin. So sin should be a very clear place where we're setting a boundary. What else? Well, because this is a stewardship, it is a gift. Children are a gift that have been given to us to care for, to nurture, to grow into adulthood. What else is our responsibility? Safety, right? Safety, protection. We've been given the responsibility to keep our children safe from all of the dangers of this sinful world, right? So we have to make regulations. We have to make rules in our house that have to do with safety. Children don't always know what's safest for them, do they? In fact, sometimes they think it's even funny to do things that aren't safe. The 2-year-old that runs towards the street where there are cars driving by, and you begin to chase them and tell them, no, don't do that. But they think it's hilarious that they're chasing them, and they see the reaction that they get when they go towards the street, and so they want to do it again and again and again and again until you bring correction and they understand, oh, that's not a good thing. When I do that, it doesn't result in a good thing. They don't understand how dangerous that is at the time, but we do. So we have to be a voice of reason and safety in our children's life. So we have to make rules that have to do with safety. That may go for your teenage children as well. They're getting out there in the world. You're giving them more freedom. But perhaps they don't understand all the things that this world has to offer in the sense of danger. And so we want to teach them at that point wisdom about things that are dangerous. So sin and safety. We have to make rules that have to do with this, sin and safety. Now, there's another catch-all, and that catch-all is actually found in our verse this morning in Colossians 3. Obey your parents in all things, right? So, because mom and dad said so. That's the catch-all. That's the catch-all. So, when we give command. Why is this so vital? That when we tell our children something, they obey it. Well, go back to that 2-year-old that doesn't understand the danger of the street and the cars that are going by, and they see that as the place where they want to go play, and they begin running towards it, and they're out of your reach, and you tell them, stop. But you haven't taught them to obey when you command. Now what? They keep going, don't they? It's a very dangerous situation. Very dangerous. So we have to teach them to obey when we issue directives. Even if you haven't established the rule, so even if you've never talked about don't play in the street, you have to be able to tell them no, stop, don't. And simply because they hear you as the authority in their life giving them a directive, they understand, oh, wait, I know what that word means. I need to listen. Even if I don't understand the rules, even if I don't understand the why, I need to listen. Now, there's a time to counsel. There's a time to explain the reasons behind the things that we say and do. But oftentimes it's not in the moment. And so our children from a very young age have to understand when I tell you something, you have to do it. Parents, together, in unity. When mom tells a child to do something, and dad swoops in and says, oh, that's okay, you don't have to do that. What are we doing? Think about the box. If one of the issues of establishing boundaries for our children is teaching them to obey commands, and then parents undermine one another, what are we doing? We're destroying the box. We're destroying it. So, children learn. I can pit mom and dad against one another. I can manipulate mom against dad, and I can manipulate dad against mom. Or, if I know that this one's going to give one answer and that one's going to give another answer, I can get away with these things over here, and I can get away with those things over there. and there's a lack of consistency. The box breaks down because mom and dad are not in unity. They're not together. When dad's away at work and mom's home with the kids, they know, oh, the box is actually out here now. It's a different box. But as soon as dad gets home, what is he having to deal with? Well, they're operating out here, and now he's having to be the one to bring them back into his box. And vice versa. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe dad doesn't pay attention. Maybe dad is just kind of off in la la land most of the time, off in his own little world, and mom is the one who's paying attention and being diligent with the boundaries that have been established. But they know because dad doesn't pay very good attention, then whenever he's around, I can get away with all sorts of stuff. But then when mom comes back, she's having to be the bad guy, and she's having to wrangle the behavior back in. Lack of consistency, right? A lack of consistency between the one flesh union. That causes the box to break down as well. So mom and dad, husband and wife, you have to be on the same page. You have to understand together what the boundaries are. You have to agree on the biblical methodology, and you both together have to be consistent. Now, if you do that, then what happens is when dad's away at work and the kids are at home with mom, they understand mom is an extension of dad's authority, and she is going to carry things out exactly as dad would, or vice versa. When mom's gone, dad is going to work hard to pay attention to what's going on. He's not going to undermine her expectations. He is going to be an extension of what she has taught us when we're with her, because they are together in this. And I can't pit them against one another, because they're going to stand as a unified front. Consistency. Consistency. Now, when children understand this, when we as parents have done the work of communicating this clearly to them from a young age, and that's the key. That's the key. We've got to communicate this from a young age. If you don't, you're going to be playing catch-up. And it's much harder to play catch-up than it is to start from a biblical foundation. You can do it, and you must do it, when you understand what faithfulness looks like, but it's much easier to start from a young age doing this. When they understand the clear boundaries, they operate freely. They operate according to their gifts. They operate according to their desires that they have the liberty to operate according to. They can express themselves, but they do it all honoring God, honoring their parents, and comprehending that this is the place where I can be free. I can be free inside the expectations. And that is a very good place for children to operate. That produces a spiritually healthy environment for children to grow up and flourish. You want to talk about flourishing? You can only flourish through honoring God. You don't flourish when you dishonor God. The world would have you believe something totally different. The world would have you to believe that righteous restrictions, expectations in accord with an absolute truth standard, consistent consequences when you cross that standard. The world would have you believe, no, that's stifling children. But the complete and total opposite is true. Total opposite is true. So, parents, this is what we're after. This is why we apply biblical methodology from an early age, setting the foundation very early on. And this is why we apply a consistency, because we are communicating something to our children. We're communicating to them, this is where you can operate. And this is a very good place to be. So, let's be committed to that. Be committed to biblical methodology. Be committed to consistency in it, which, by the way, that's not easy. I'm not going to pretend like it's easy. That's hard, right? That is hard work. Maintaining consistency with a right heart according to biblical methodology, that's hard work. but it is a stewardship that we've been given. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, thank you so much for the truth of your word. Thank you for giving us all the practical measures that do work according to what you have laid out for us to accomplish. You've given us the tools that we need, and so we praise you for that. Thank you for giving us the tools that we need to operate according to your expectations. May we operate according to those boundaries that you have set for us as well as adults. It's in your name that I pray. Amen.